Today's episode is brought to you by the IFS Institute. We're excited to invite you to the 2024 IFS Virtual Conference happening October 24th and 25th. Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just curious about internal family systems, this event is for you. Join us online for 2 days of transformational learning, dynamic workshops, and insightful talks from leading voices in the fields of therapy, coaching, and beyond. It's the perfect opportunity to deepen your understanding, connect with a global community, and explore how IFS can enrich you both personally and professionally. Grab your tickets at the links in my bio to let them know that you heard about this on The One Inside. Welcome to Season 6 of The One Inside, an Internal Family Systems podcast. I'm Tammy Sollenberger, author of The One Inside, 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about their inner world and who have a desire to connect to that authentic self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I am super excited today to talk to Dr. Natalie Thomas. Dr. Thomas is going to be speaking at, I never call people doctor, so I just thought I would say, actually, yeah, is that weird?
Just call me Natalie, yeah.
So Natalie is speaking at the conference. And so what is the name of your, because I have so much information in front of me. I'm like, what is the name of your?
It's basically looking at climate distress, climate emotions, parts we have related to that. And then also seeing how it can work with ecotherapy in particular, so like as an approach to working with climate distress.
You have also written a couple articles for Parts and Self, which is for people that don't know, there's the IFS Institute, which is the training of all the IFS. And then there is the Center for Self-Leadership, or the Foundation for Self-Leadership, I think is what it's called. And they produce this magazine. It's an online magazine called Parts and Self. So people can we can put some links to those articles or something in the show notes. So what I thought we would talk about is, what did you just say about ecology?
Oh, right. So sort of ecotherapy. And as I'm saying,
that's it. I was like, you just said a word and I was like, ooh, let's talk about that word. Yes.
Yeah. Ecotherapy is it's an approach, right? Like a therapeutic approach, and it can take different forms. Some people might talk about walk and talk therapy. And so you literally walk and talk outside and you take your therapy sessions outside. So walk and talk therapy can be sort of I find it's more of like a common way of referring to something like ecotherapy. But the kind of thinking behind ecotherapy is that when you take therapy and the relationship into nature becomes part of that relationship. It's not just a kind of container that you're using, but nature becomes it becomes a triad more than a dyad, right? I tend to think in IFS, it supports connection with our self-energy. I think it's where self-energy comes from is the earth. So I do tend to think that when we're in nature, we can access our self-energy and our parts. It can shift a little bit how we're able to then be in relation to our parts, kind of like an internal ecosystem, right? I tend to think of it that way. It's internal family systems, but it's really like there's an ecosystem inside and outside. We're part of the ecosystem. And so it kind of can support the process.
When you're talking, I can kind of feel myself expand, just talking about nature, like just talking about it. So I want to talk about what you said. I want to land a little bit on self. What self is, what do you think about self? And you said self comes from nature. Tell me what you mean by that. Self comes from the earth, I think is what you said.
Yeah. I guess we all have different thoughts, right? On what self is. And I maybe a little bit of background, because I come to this from, so I studied philosophy, right? For like many, many, many years. And that was my academic background and training. And in my master's level, I was studying the intrinsic value of nature. And so I was studying these different theories of nature and that kind of thing. And then when I got into sort of the PhD level, I shifted towards animals. But one of my professors asked me, like, what is the fundamental thing that makes us care ethically about anyone else? And I actually, I wrestled with that question for months and months, and then came back and said, it's when we recognize self in someone else. And that can be an animal and it can be a human. And of course, in the back of my mind was like, and it can be nature, but I didn't want to quite go that far because I think she may have been a little like, okay. But it really, so it was interesting. I became really interested. So I did all the studying. I was like, I want to understand self-consciousness and self-awareness. And I studied psychology and neuroscience and then religion, concepts in Buddhism and all these things. So it was really interesting. And this is before I knew anything about IFS. So when I came to IFS, it was really interesting to me that I had spent so many years of my life studying it from this other perspective. And then suddenly it was like learning to get a felt sense or experience of what that feels like inside was absolutely new to me in a way, but also I was looking back and thinking the moments where I felt this were always in nature or in connection to some other being. And that's kind of what came to me was like, right, so there's something there. And then just thinking about, there's sort of this idea of like an ecological self. And to me, I started to think, where did self come from? Like evolutionarily, like, all these different, you can think of it spiritually, there's all these different ways to think about it. And then I thought, well, in a way, like we evolved, well, not in a way, we literally did evolve on this planet. So it feels like, this connection that we have with self, to me, means that there is something that is self, that is just earth.
So I love this. 'Cause I'm thinking about this idea that like there is this self-consciousness, there is this self in the earth, in the trees, in the ground, in other living beings like animals. And so can we talk a little bit about the idea of self in nature, and what does that mean? Like, is that in sort of the livingness of nature, the life energy of nature?
It's very interesting because I can sense that even now, like I have part of me is like scrambling to go academically, and other parts are like, wait a minute, this is more like a felt sense that there's something there. And when you mention kind of there are these, different philosophical schools, right, from around the world and from thousands of years ago that do talk about that kind of life, whatever that is, that energy, life force, consciousness maybe, that is characteristic of just all living things. It's interesting because even my academic and thinking parts are kind of like, in the research I did, I also wanted to be mindful of kind of distinguishing between, there is a difference between like a plant and an animal in a certain kind of way. So they might share these like some sorts of these properties, but like animals can obviously feel pain or like suffer and have emotions and a mentality that in a certain sense plants, I just don't think have. And I think that's the part of me that does so much ethics work, wants to say it's really important ethically to remember both sameness and difference, right? So just like with other humans, right, that even like our social positioning puts us in these different social spaces that have real ethical implications for people. And also, I would say then also for animals and also for nature, we can recognize like we have these ethical obligations to others, and I think also to nature. And
yeah, when I'm feeling, it's like how what I would eat, or like what I would ingest, or how I would treat an animal or a tree or a plant, how I would, what my relationship with those things are. That's what I'm hearing, is sort of like, what's my relationship with those things?
Well, it's right. And that's where I think so again, like with, the self and our parts, there's that, even in this work, right? When I'm with a client, let's say, or I'm with someone, and you can sort of see and sense when there's a shift, right, towards their own parts. So it's like you start with a little bit of, maybe, what's going on, and you notice that there might be parts that are like, oh, this other part, like, just get rid of it. And then as we get to know it, and then there's sort of this shift where it's like, oh, and it's like a seeing, I call it, like you really see the self really sees the part. And it's like that when you can really suddenly see like nature or aspects of nature or animals where you really see them. And maybe that's it. It's seeing the connection to self in the living world that just shifts a little of like that allows us to feel maybe sometimes some sadness for the tree that gets cut down. And I think that's, I tend to be very sensitive to that. So I maybe, so I am actually fine with that now. When I was younger, I was very self-conscious of the fact that I would burst into tears over, a tree being cut down or something like that. Now I'm like, yeah, I'm just really sensitive to it, but it's that felt connection. Yeah. And that there's something there. Right. And I feel like because it's so familiar, the feeling, the sensation, what it's like to connect with my part, let's say that's suffering, and really feel that feels the same as when I connect with an animal or connect with something in nature. It feels the same.
So that's beautiful. So what about the idea of myself connecting to the self of nature or the self of animals or parts of, are there parts of, you talk about parts of animals, are there parts of selves or parts of nature? So I guess that's a weird question, but
No, it's a really cool question, actually. It's because when I think of it as like, if I think of nature as a system, then it would kind of almost make sense that there is self and parts, just as there are maybe in animals and humans. I don't know exactly what that looks like. And actually, it really, it sparks my curiosity in a way that I really appreciate, because now I have parts that are like, we're going to take note of that and have a little think about it. If you think about, there's like our internal system, there's our families, external family systems, our social systems, cultural systems, ecosystems, larger systems, right? Atmosphere, solar system. Like, it's just kind of neat when you start thinking about all the different systems within systems within systems. And then also like the sum being greater than its parts comes up too somehow. And maybe that's where maybe it's more of almost like the self energy that's in all of that just permeates all of it. And then the way our brains and our minds function is the way I kind of see it is that it has to make sense of everything.
But I love this because if we think about self begets self, right? And parts beget parts. And so if my dog, I have a corgi and she's, and corgis are super protective. They have a legacy burden of being protective and like hoarding sheep and nipping at the sheep's heels. And sort of that's their legacy burden. And so she'll do that when we're like on a walk and she sees some stranger. And so she'll do that. So I can see her go into protective, and, it's very obvious when she's in that part. And then then I have a part, right? I have a part that like freaks out and yells and gets scared and, doesn't act like the pet mom that I want to be. I don't want to yell and, sort of, but that part of her really triggers a part of me. So that makes sense to me. And then there's the other sort of like, we can snuggle up and she can be all snuggly. And then my nervous system calms down, myself, more present self, me, and then maybe more present self of her and herself and myself and both of our nervous systems, just like with your kid, right? Like that makes a lot of sense to me that I've never thought about that before until you said that. I was like, that makes sense.
As you're saying that, even it's kind of neat to think about like self-led companionship with animals, right? Like, what does that look like? And absolutely, we have parts that are going to get nervous or freaked out or like worried about what our companion's going to do and all that kind of stuff as well. What's coming to mind is, right, and I was just a PA in a level 1 training, and one of the participants, again, kind of sort of reminded me, but brought up the idea of like the more healing we do internally and how it just has that impact on everything around us. So as you're kind of saying that, I'm thinking like, yeah, like even when we do that work, right, around our own parts and our own healing, and how does that shift how we are with all beings, not just other humans, right? And our human relationships, but also all of our other relationships, because it is all relationship. It's easy to forget that we're in a relationship with nature, so to speak, because we're often indoors and in these and live our lives sort of disconnected. But it just reminds me of that kind of, there's that outflow, that kind of the more I work with my system, the more it shifts outwards, right? And has that larger kind of impact.
Will you talk about, I love this phrase, interspecies healing?
Yeah, that's partly, for years, for a lot of years, I've always had this deep drive, I guess. I saw it as a drive, going back, thinking of myself as like a teenager. The 90s was all like save the whales, right? And like green, everything. So I definitely come from that kind of, I always felt a very powerful pull to fight for nature and animals, but that kind of drive to just make the situation better, to stop, I guess, to reduce suffering, but I didn't see it that way at the time. So a lot of people that work in activism and really want to change the way things are to make things better for animals, for nature, for other humans, there can be that real push and drive, and it can really burn you out, because it is, even though there's self in there, it can be very, very parts led, right? And parts driven. And there's an urgency and I got to do it all. So there can be a lot of parts that are absolutely beautiful, wonderful, will make change in the world parts. And they can also be really heavy with burdens. For me, that's where the climate stuff comes in too, is that a lot of people that I've worked with that have come in saying, I want to work with my own climate anxiety and my grief and, that kind of thing. And it always amazes me that as soon as we start to go towards those parts, we go straight back to other pain, to deeper parts that are holding burdens of not being safe, of being alone. Some of our young parts hold on to. And that I really come to kind of sink into the more healing we can do in our own system, then the work shifts. It just shifts. It doesn't feel so much about, oh, I got to do it all. It's, yes, there's urgency, absolutely. But a little bit of that shift to more there are all of these different ways and different people that can work together, right, to do all these things. And when it comes from a place of feeling a little more equilibrium inside, then that can bring more outside. And to me, that's really the kind of key, to all of that kind of work with animals, with humans. How do we shift? I'm in those spheres, right? Of course, animal rights. I've been very much there, and you want to stop all of it. You want to stop all of the factory farming and the experimentation and all of the things, which I think, I do still think there is so much unnecessary suffering. It had to shift in me, though. There had to be that shift in me to be able to kind of follow then. And what is that self-led action that I can take that's more focused? It's clearer. It has a little more calmness in it. So my system isn't overwhelmed. I've read, I remember reading even in No Bad Parts, but could see almost like Dick Schwartz, leaning into some of that in that book. And that's what also kind of keyed me into, wait a minute, there's something here that the more we work with our parts and heal our system, we naturally then, there's this natural outpouring of care for the earth. And he describes that in that book. And that really was that's it, right? It just comes naturally. It doesn't have to be, oh, I have to do this. I have to recycle. It doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels more like this is just, I just naturally want to do this because I feel more care and connection towards nature. And that's different.
Yeah. Yeah. So you keep mentioning felt sense. And I was thinking, there's a felt sense difference. And I think it would, there's a part of me that's I think it would be offensive if I said to my friend or my client or my peer, this activism part of you is a part. And I think that there's some, we're not supposed to do that anyways, but let's just say, because that that, and then there's some, and you talk about the powerlessness kind of, that predates, we use this word in IFS that, right, there's something happening right now and I'm having some activation around it because there's something that predates it. So yes, I'm upset about the animal rights or animal all the awful stuff with animals. I'm upset about that. But the upset is a predating in my system. I think that's what I'm hearing you say. And so if I go back, if I self can go back and find out what's going on, if there's feelings of powerlessness or helplessness or unlovability or something back there, and I can unburden that, and then I and self with more of me and more of that clear, calm, even compassion for the bad guy, then that is it. Oh, I want to be that. I don't really want to be angry and irritated and desperate and scared. I don't really want to be that way. And I hear you say too, I don't need to be that way in order to be an activist either.
Yeah, and there can be, right, like you're saying, definitely, because I think with animals there can be, especially if, there can be a resonance with the powerlessness of animals. I can see that, right? Like animals are pretty much ultimately powerless, right? We have the ability to do what we want to them. And there can be that can really activate, right? If we have parts that have felt powerless and been subject to things that are harmful and painful, then it can really bring that up. So there can be this beautiful deep healing of that. I now also see it as a little bit more of like, I still resonate with pain and suffering of animals, but it's a little different and it's not overwhelming. That's the difference, maybe. It's not overwhelming. It can inform me and kind of, okay, this is what, like, I'm noticing this. And it can kind of like direct. Then it's like, okay, so I'm resonating with some of that, even anger, right? Because of course, anger has its place too. And those parts are needed. Having more self-led anger and self-led empathy, which is different, right, from compassion. But the empathy does, I think, has an important role. When we empathize with the suffering of another, for me, it was always a motivation. It was like, okay, right, I see that, I feel that, and it motivates me. And can I sit with that and see if once I kind of can tap into that enough self-energy, then it can kind of shift towards compassion. I think there's both. And I think empathy is really important as well, because it's a motivation and it's that it's resonance, right? When I empathize with you, I'm resonating in some level, literally, right? My part is feeling that pain on some level. And that's very powerful for healing. If there's enough self there to hold it.
I always think of like the witnessing, right? Like sort of the empathy is like I'm feeling with, and with, we talk about witness is sort of the witnessing as a witness. And so that's, yeah. Yeah. But if my part is feeling, I'm not going to say this right, but if my part is feeling too with, then it's going to be like, I remember one time my son, I don't know what was going on with me, but he was taking a stick and he was like beating a tree with a stick. I mean, he's a boy. And I was like, stop hitting the tree. Stop hitting the tree. And then he was like, you're nuts. And I'm going to keep hitting the tree because I don't understand why you're telling me not to hit the tree, which is, his parts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember being like, there's some part of me that was like, you're hurting the tree.
Right. Yes. And I think, right? I mean, I think some people have, maybe that's a gift, right? Like sometimes I have parts of me that look at suffering, even my own suffering. And I'm like, at first, right, before I work with it, I might be like, that's not a gift. That just sucked, plain and simple. But I have to say that they do turn into gifts, right? If we keep working with our system, they turn into gifts. And the gift is to be able to really want to, right, protect and take care of and care for beings other than, ourselves and other humans. And I think that's a beautiful gift, right, for people that feel that. And I really, I think that's where my interest and the moving towards like the climate distress. I run climate cafes, the the Climate Psychology Alliance offers these climate cafe trainings, and I did that and then started offering them. And I was just so moved by the sharing of people of all ages, right? Not just young people, not just like people of all ages that are holding this distress in various ways. And so, and then as I deepened into IFS, I was like, every time I do a climate cafe, I'm like, I'm doing IFS. Like I'm not calling it that, but I'm like, I'm doing IFS. And then seeing that, yeah, these are parts, right? These are parts that people are speaking for. And in these climate cafes, and then
having that witness experience of each other, right? They're witnessing each other, and then there's more self there, which is so beautiful.
It's beautiful. And at the end of those, I usually ask, like, what's one word, right, to describe what you're harvesting from this. And it always was so interesting. I've always kept these lists of those words, and it's always like connected, right? Community.
Wow.
Relief. Right? So when you think, I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of self words that come up when, again, I know there's a lot more than the 8 C's for self, but you know what I mean? There's a lot of qualities of self energy that just from sitting with each other, I think, and sharing, like you were saying with the animal, when we share with the animal and we co-regulate and we hold each other's, parts. Again, I would say parts, not that I would say it in those, but just that was really powerful and kind of just really got me thinking about, what would it look like to use IFS in that context, right? Just like apply it and for people's parts that are all being impacted by all of this, what's happening right around us. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Well, what are some practices? We only have a few minutes left. So practices that we can all do, or what do you want to share around that?
Yeah, gosh. Oh, there's so many. I guess what came into my mind first was actually slowing down, right? Like slowing down in nature, as in forest bathing. If you're familiar with forest bathing, is kind of I don't know if you are. Okay, you got to look up forest bathing. It's just the most beautiful practice, but it's slowing down and engaging with your senses in nature. So rather than like, I'm going to hike through this forest, right, and it's going to be a 2-hour hike, and I've got my water bottle, and like, so you're kind of marching along, and you might appreciate some views, but forest bathing is a really cool example of like where you actually will slow right down and like touch, the bark on this tree and this leaf or these needles, smell them, like you're engaging all of your senses. You might sit and close your eyes and listen and just listen, right? Or, I have to say, bare feet on the ground. I love that so much. If I can just sit and do that for 10 minutes, it really helps. Me, or some people, it's just be sitting by the water somewhere, if it's a river, lake, pond. So anything like that, like just really simple, slowing down and just engaging the senses, right? Or with the animal, also slowing down, right? Like we often like feed them, walk them, do this, do that, or just, which again, I appreciate. We have busy lives, of course we do. But there's also just that, like, just like you said, like just being with my dog and seeing what comes up, right? Like just noticing what comes up. But any kinds of practices like that, breathing outside, taking in the air, anything like that, even if it's just a couple of short minutes, is often enough, right? And there's, again, my little nerdy research side is like, the research is so beautiful that even around forest bathing, coming from Japan, right? And like Shinrin-yoku, they've got a whole body of research on what happens when you are in a forest. It's amazing. The smell, it affects the chemicals in our brain. It reduces our cortisol. So it has these physiological effects. And to me, that allows us to connect to our self-energy, to our own self-energy, and then through the earth, right?
Yeah, I love that. It's like it's like bathing in self, right? Yes. If I'm in the forest, then it's like I'm bathing in self. Yeah.
I'm going to write that down because I really love that.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
It's like forest bathing is self-bathing. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, beautiful.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. How can people find out about you and your climate cafes and all the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm just in the process of having my website fully redesigned. So it's a little au naturel accordion from me. But just thomascounseling.com is my website. So I do have some different pages with information. I will be, I'm working on some workshops to support people that want to work around climate distress with IFS. So there's that kind of work as well. And then climate cafes, I'm also kind of restructuring very slightly, but I usually run them once a month, just online. So again, they're kind of open.
Great.
And I train facilitators. So if people are interested, you don't have to be a therapist to hold a climate cafe. You can just be anyone that wants to hold that space. So I am quite happy. I just trained some people at a college, and we're going to run the first one next week. And then, but I'm happy to do that for people too.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. This is amazing. And we will see you at the conference.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you left a rating, a review, a like, comment, share with your family, your friends. That would mean so much to me. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or on Amazon. You can visit my website, tammysallenberger.com, or you can download a free Get to Know a Should part of you. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and at The One Inside on Facebook and on YouTube. Jeff Schrum co-produces The One Inside, and I am forever grateful for Jeff. Also thankful for Jack Reardon for creating the music, and just thank you for listening. 6 seasons, over 1 million downloads. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you in this community. I'll see you next time.